Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson, and today I'm covering plot hooks which were cut out of the Magonamoia Bestiary because they contain themes of sexual violence. That's a content warning. I took over The Unicorn and Basilisk after another author had to step aside from the project, and initially I wrote them close to period folklore. The Unicorn needed a serious rework after I'd finished it. It wouldn't get past your sensitivity reader because I was working the virginity angle as a plot hook. To me, it seemed like a worthwhile connection. Elizabeth makes a lot of political capital out of her virginity. She's constantly offering to consider marriage to foreign nobles and then moving on. For American listeners, the first English colony in your country was named Virginia as a compliment to her. It could have been Gloriana, but no. I, personally, live in a state in Australia called Queensland, which was similarly named to flatter a queen, in our case Victoria, and Victoria was already taken. They could have gone with Elizabeth Land, Queensland. They went with Virginia. Similarly, the first European-descended baby in the colony was Virginia Dare. She's got a Wikipedia page. She shows up in your art. I first heard about her when I was a 20-something listening to Tori Amos. Some of the Americans listening to this will already know Virginia Dare's name, but they may not know how weird that is. Other colonial governors didn't deliberately name their grandkids to flatter the monarch, let alone her virginity. I'm Australian. What was the name of the first white baby in Australia? We don't know. No one made a fuss about it at the time, and as I've aged, different answers have emerged from historians scraping ideas out of period accounts. The name I was told was right back when I was an undergraduate doesn't even appear on the lists anymore. The name that was a consensus for a while, Rebecca Small, was discredited when someone went back to the period record and noticed that she is accounted the first freeborn baby. Most historians believe there were approximately 20 babies born to convict mothers before her, and we have no idea who most of them were. The dark horse in this historical puzzle is Siebeyer van Nieuweland, who was born to a woman on a Dutch whaling vessel before New South Wales was settled. The problem is his name literally means seaborn in the new land, so was he born on ship or on Dirk Hartog Island? We don't know, and regardless, he's not named after Queen Victoria's hymen, which is the point I was making. I'm only mentioning him because I think his name is perfect for a Selkie. So, a plot hook was cut. It mentions that Elizabeth had a guardian who tried to sexually abuse her into marriage. This was Thomas Seymour, who was a perfect villain for games in which King Edward or Queen Jane survive. He was the brother of Jane Seymour, a previous queen and the mother of King Edward. After King Henry VIII died, Thomas Seymour married Catherine Parr, Henry's final wife. She was one of the richest women in the kingdom and was Elizabeth's formal guardian. Thomas's brother, yet another Edward, was effectively regent for the prince, king. He thought his brother was a worm and tried to get him to go away with an enormous bribe. He gave him a barony and made him head of the Admiralty, and that worked for a while, but eventually Thomas became his nephew's favourite relative, and you couldn't get him out of court. Thomas waged several campaigns to marry Elizabeth. There was, at this point, no strong claim that she would ever become queen. King Edward would, it was hoped, have children. Henry VIII's will removed his daughters from the line of succession. King Edward likewise pushed the crown to his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, so that his Catholic, legally illegitimate sister would be excluded. There is a chance, though, he thought he might be king. Remember that at this stage, our modern belief that the husband of the queen is just some random guy wasn't certain then. Skipping Jane, the next regnant queen, Mary, gave the title of king to her husband, Philip of Spain. Similarly, the first regnant queen after Elizabeth, also a Mary, was co-ruler with her husband, King William. Our modern certainty that the queen's husband is just a guy comes from Queen Empress Victoria telling everyone that's how it was. Elizabeth held Thomas off with legions of maids, shrewd politics, and cutting letters. And here's the hook. Monarchs maintain menageries of odd creatures as a show of opulence and influence. England's is in the Tower of London. A friendly non-player character wishes to give a unicorn to Her Majesty. To ensure they gain the maximum social cachet, they want to present it as a surprise gift at court. As an alternative, the Spanish ambassador may bring it as a gift. This is a dreadfully bad idea. Characters may be sent to steal or surreptitiously kill the unicorn that intelligence services have heard is to be presented to Her Majesty. Poison won't work, so the characters will need to find a different but equally discreet way of killing or removing the animal. If the unicorn refuses to put its head on the Virgin Queen's lap, then her statements to foreign princes that she might be available for marriage no longer carry weight. Her story that she is married to the realm is damaged. Catholic rumours that she is living adulterously with Lord Darnley are furthered. If she refuses to face the test of the unicorn, that's interpreted as a confession. Even if Elizabeth is not having a relationship with Darnley, she may want to refuse the test because rumours insist one of her early guardians attempted to force her into marriage by molesting her. Satyrs. Similarly, there was a plot cut from Satyrs because there was a theme of sexual violence in it. Eventually, the Satyrs were completely reworked as fauns, creatures from industrial-era folklore. The idea that the reason you don't see satyrs anymore is because tripping fairies have hunted them to extinction is from Lamia by John Keats, a romantic poet from the 19th century. The part I'm referencing is: once upon a time, before the fairy broods drove nymph and satyr from the prosperous woods, before King Oberon's bright diadem, sceptre and mantle clasped with dewy gem, frightened away the dryads and the fauns from rushes green and brakes and cowslipped lawns, the ever-smitten Hermes empty left his golden throne, bent warm on amorous theft. Here's the hook. Peace with Titania. Titania's hatred of satyrs is based on her knowing most of the women in Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is filled with gods and mystical beings either raping women or women fleeing attempted rape until they're transformed into trees or animals, which isn't acknowledged as harm. She's not correct that all satyrs behave like this. Each Selinus has raised his sons differently, and the tribes who have survived are those who are cautious when interacting with humans. Titania's hatred of satyrs is a prejudice formed thousands of years ago on the other side of the continent. If the player characters can convince her local satyrs are not the same as the ancient tribes, her policy to them can change. The satyrs she remembers were riotous mobs of Dionysius worshippers accompanied by drug-frenzied humans. The player characters might convince her that satyrs have a place in her court. They could serve as counselors, warriors, or musicians in exchange for her protection for the rest of their tribe. The player characters might instead demonstrate that satyrs are insignificant compared to the other enemies which could be faced. The character we move towards is the Piper at the Gates of Dawn, which comes from far after the rain. It's from The Wind in the Willows. As a setup to the extract which is to follow, a young otter named Portly has gone missing, so Rat and Mole paddle upriver to look for him. Rat begins to hear ethereal music within the sounds of nature. Ars Magica players will spot the Reggio right away. The reader for this extract is Adrian Pratzelis, who released it into the public domain through LibriVox. Thanks to Adrian and his production team.
The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. Read by Adrian Pratzelis. Chapter 7. The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. You stayed to supper, I suppose? It's gone, sighed the rat, sinking back in his seat again. So beautiful and strange and new. Since it was to end so soon, I'd almost wished I'd never heard it, for it has roused a longing in me that is pain, and nothing seems worth while but just to hear that sound once more and go on listening to it forever. No, there it is again, he cried, alert once more. Entranced, he was silent for a long space, spellbound. Now it passes on, and I begin to lose it, he said presently. Oh, Mole, the beauty of it! The merry bubble and joy, the thin, clear, happy call of the distant piping. Such music I never dreamed of, and the call in it is stronger even than the music is sweet. Row on, Mole, row! For the music and the call must be for us." The mole, greatly wondering, obeyed. "I hear nothing myself," he said, "but the wind playing in the reeds and rushes and osiers." The rat never answered, if indeed he heard. Rapt, transported, trembling, he was possessed in all his senses by this new divine thing that caught up his helpless soul and swung and dandled it, a powerless but happy infant, in a strong sustaining grasp. In silence Mole rowed steadily, and soon they came to a point where the river divided, a long backwater branching off to one side. With a slight movement of his head, Rat, who had long dropped the rudder lines, directed the rower to take the backwater. The creeping tide of light gained and gained, and now they could see the colour of the flowers that gemmed the water's edge. "Clearer and nearer still," cried the rat joyously. "Now you must surely hear it. Ah, at last I see you do." Breathless and transfixed, the mole stopped rowing as the liquid run of that glad piping broke on him like a wave, caught him up, and possessed him utterly. He saw the tears in his comrade's cheeks, and bowed his head and understood. For a space they hung there, brushed by the purple loosestrife that fringed the bank. Then the clear, imperious summons that marched hand in hand with the intoxicating melody imposed its will on Mole, and mechanically he bent his oars again. And the light grew steadily stronger, but no birds sang as they were wont to do at the approach of dawn. But for the heavenly music all was marvellously still. On either side of them, as they glided onwards, the rich meadow grass seemed that morning of a freshness and greenness unsurpassable. Never had they noticed the roses so vivid, the willow herb so riotous, the meadow sweet so odorous and pervading. Then the murmur of the approaching weir began to hold the air, and they felt a consciousness that they were nearing the end, whatever it might be that surely awaited their expedition. A wide half-circle of foam and glinting light and shining shoulders of green water, the great weir closed the backwater from bank to bank, troubled all the quiet surface with twirling eddies and floating foam streaks, and deadened all other sound with its solemn and soothing rumble. In midmost of the stream, embraced in the weir's shimmering arm-spread, a small island lay anchored, fringed close with willow and silver birch and alder. Reserved, shy, but full of significance, it hid whatever it might hold behind a veil, keeping it till the hour should come, and with the hour those who were called and chosen. Slowly, but with no doubt or hesitation whatever, and in something of a solemn expectancy, the two animals passed through the broken, tumultuous water, and moored their boat at the flowery margin of the island. In silence they landed, and pushed through the blossom and scented herbage and undergrowth that led to the level ground, till they stood on a little lawn of a marvellous green, set round with nature's own orchard trees, crab-apple, wild cherry, and sloe. "This is the place of my song-dream, the place the music played to me," whispered the rat, as if in a trance. "Here, in this holy place, here, if anywhere, surely we shall find him." Then suddenly the mole felt a great awe fall upon him, an awe that turned his muscles to water, bowed his head, and rooted his feet to the ground. It was no panic terror. Indeed, he felt wonderfully at peace and happy, but it was an awe that smote and held him, and without seeing he knew it could only mean that some august presence was very, very near. With difficulty he turned to look for his friend, and saw him at his side, cowed, stricken and trembling violently. And still there was utter silence in the populous bird-haunted branches around them, and still the light grew and grew. Perhaps he would never have dared to raise his eyes, but that, though the piping was now hushed, the call and the summons seemed dominant and imperious. He might not refuse were Death himself waiting to strike him instantly, once he had looked with mortal eye on things rightly kept hidden. Trembling he obeyed, and raised his humble head, and then, in that utter clearness of the imminent dawn, while nature, flushed with fullness of incredible colour, seemed to hold her breath for the event, he looked in the very eyes of the friend and helper, saw the backward sweep of the curved horns gleaming in the glowing daylight, saw the stern hooked nose between the kindly eyes that were looking down on them humorously, while the bearded mouth broke into a half-smile at the corners, saw the rippling muscles on the arm that lay across the broad chest, the long supple hand still holding the pan-pipes, only just fallen away from the parted lips, saw the splendid curves of the shaggy limbs disposed in majestic ease on the sward, saw, last of all, nestling between his very hoofs, sleeping soundly in entire peace and contentment, the little round, podgy, childish form of the baby otter. All this he saw, for one moment breathless and intense, vivid on the morning sky, and still as he looked he lived, and still as he lived he wondered. "Rat," he found breath to whisper, shaking, "are you afraid?" "Afraid?" murmured the rat, his eyes shining with unutterable love. "Afraid of him? Oh, never, never! And yet, oh, Mole, I am afraid." Then the two animals, crouching to the earth, bowed their heads and did worship. Sudden and magnificent, the sun's broad golden disk showed itself over the horizon facing them, and the first rays shooting across the level water meadows took the animals full in the eyes and dazzled them. When they were able to look once more, the vision had vanished, and the air was full of the carol of birds that hailed the dawn. As they stared blankly in dumb misery, deepening as they slowly realized all they had seen and all they had lost, a capricious little breeze danced up from the surface of the water, tossed the aspens, shook the dewy roses, and blew lightly and caressingly in their faces, and with its soft touch came instant oblivion. For this is the last best gift that the kindly demigod is careful to bestow on those to whom he has revealed himself in their helping, the gift of forgetfulness, lest the awful remembrance should remain and grow and overshadow mirth and pleasure, and the great haunting memory should spoil all the afterlives of little animals helped out of difficulties, in order that they should be happy and light-hearted as before. Mole rubbed his eyes and stared at Rat, who was looking at him in a puzzled sort of way. I beg your pardon. What did you say, Rat?" he asked. "I was only remarking," said the rat slowly, "that this was the right sort of place, and that here, if anywhere, we should find him. And look, why, there he is, the little fellow!" And with a cry of delight he ran toward the slumbering Portly. But Mole stood still a moment, held in thought, as one awakened suddenly from a beautiful dream, who struggles to recall it, and can recapture nothing but a dim sense of the beauty of it, the beauty, till that too fades away in its turn, and the dreamer bitterly accepts the hard, cold waking and all its penalties. So Mole, after struggling with his memory for a brief space, shook his head sadly and followed the rat. Portly woke up with a joyous squeak, and wriggled with pleasure at the sight of his father's friends, who had played with him so often in past days. In a moment, however, his face grew blank, and he fell to hunting around in a circle with pleading whine, as a child that has fallen happily asleep in its nurse's arms, and wakes to find itself alone and laid in a strange place, and searches corners and cupboards, and runs from room to room, despair growing silently in its heart. Even so Portly searched the island, and searched, dogged and unwearying, till at last the black moment came for giving it up, and sitting down and crying bitterly. The Mole ran quickly to comfort the little animal, but Rat, lingering, looked long and doubtful at certain hoof marks deep in the sward. "Some great animal has been here," he murmured slowly and thoughtfully, and stood musing, his mind strangely stirred. "Come along, Rat," called the Mole. "Think of poor Otter waiting up there by the ford." Portly had soon been comforted by the promise of a treat, a jaunt on the river in Mr. Rat's real boat, and the two animals conducted him to the water's side, placed him securely between them in the bottom of the boat, and paddled off down the backwater. The sun was fully up now and hot on them. The birds sang lustily and without restraint, and flowers smiled and nodded from either bank, but somehow, so thought the animals, with less of richness and blaze of colour than they seemed to remember seeing quite recently somewhere. They wondered where. The main river reached again, they turned the boat's head upstream toward the point where they knew their friend was keeping his lonely vigil. As they drew near the familiar ford, the Mole took the boat into the bank, and they lifted Portly out and set him on his legs on the towpath, gave him his marching orders and a friendly pat on the back, and shoved out into midstream. They watched the little animal as he waddled along the path contentedly and with importance, watched him till they saw his muzzle suddenly lift and his waddle break into a clumsy amble as he quickened his pace with shrill whines and wriggles of recognition. Looking up the river, they could see Otter start up, tense and rigid, from out of the shadows where he crouched in dumb patience, and could hear his amazed and joyous bark as he bounded up through the osiers onto the path. Then the Mole, with a strong pull on one oar, swung the boat round and let the full stream bear them down again whither it would, their quest now happily ended. "I feel strangely tired, Rat," said the Mole, leaning wearily over his oars as the boat drifted. "It's been up all night, you'll say perhaps, but that's nothing. We do as much half the nights of the week at this time of year. No, I feel as if I had been through something very exciting and rather terrible, and it was just over, and yet nothing particular has happened." "Or something very surprising and splendid and beautiful," murmured the Rat, leaning back and closing his eyes. "I feel just as you do, Mole. Simply dead tired, though not body tired. It's lucky we've got the stream with us to take us home. Isn't it jolly to feel the sun again, soaking into one's bones, and hark to the wind playing in the reeds? It's like music, far-away music," said the Mole, nodding drowsily. "So I was thinking," murmured the Rat, dreamily and languid. "Dance music, the lilting sort that runs on without a stop, but with words in it too. It passes into words and out of them again. I catch them at intervals. Then it is dance music once more, and then nothing but the reeds' soft thin whispering." "You can hear better than I," said the Mole sadly. "I cannot catch the words." "Let me try to give you them," said the Rat softly, his eyes still closed. "Now it is turning into words again, faint but clear." lest the awe should dwell and turn your frolic to fret. You shall look on my power at the helping hour, but then you shall forget. Now the reeds take it up. Forget, forget, they sigh, and it dies away in a rustle and a whisper. Then the voice returns, lest limbs be reddened and rent. I spring the trap that is set. As I loose the snare you may glimpse me there, for surely you shall forget. Row nearer, Mole, nearer to the reeds. It is hard to catch, and grows each minute fainter. Helper and helper I cheer, small waifs in the woodland wet. Strays I find in it, wounds I bind in it, bidding them all forget. Nearer, Mole, nearer. No, it's no good. The song has died away into reed talk. But what do the words mean? Asked the wondering Mole. That I do not know, said the Rat simply. I passed them on to you as they reached me. Ah, now they return again, and this time full and clear. This time at last it is the real, unmistakable thing. Simple, passionate, perfect. Well, let's have it then, said the Mole, after he had waited patiently for a few minutes, half dozing in the hot sun. But no answer came. He looked and understood the silence. With a smile of much happiness on his face, and something of a listening look still lingering there, the weary Rat was fast asleep.
Your saga may vary.